I never planned on spending the winter alone in that cabin. It wasn't even mine. A friend of a friend had mentioned it offhand at a party. Something about a place his uncle owned way up north where no one lived during the off-season. He said it was well-stocked, had a wood stove, even a generator, and that if I needed a place to get away for a while, it was mine. I didn't think I'd take him up on it. But when things in my life took a turn, job gone, relationship over, nowhere to be, I found myself driving through miles of snow-covered roads, looking for that turnoff he had marked on my phone. The road leading to the cabin was barely visible under a thick layer of snow, and my tires struggled for traction as I eased my way down the narrow path. It was deeper in the woods than I expected, a good 20 minutes off the nearest paved road. By the time I pulled up, the sun had started setting, casting long blue shadows across the untouched snow. The cabin itself was simple, one story, weathered wood, a sloped roof heavy with snow. A shed stood off to the side, half buried, and a narrow porch wrapped around the front. I killed the engine and stepped out. The silence was immediate and absolute. No wind, no animals, just my own boots crunching as I walked to the door. The lock was stiff, but after a few tries, I got it open. Inside, it smelled like cold wood and old dust. The furniture was basic, a worn couch, a wooden table, a small kitchen in the corner. A hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The generator was outside, just behind the shed, but there was no need for it yet. I wanted to keep things quiet, keep the place simple. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time splitting firewood, making simple meals, and walking through the trees. The snow was deep, but the trails around the cabin were packed down enough that I could hike without too much trouble. I found animal tracks, rabbits, maybe a fox, but never saw anything bigger. At night, the silence felt heavier. I'd hear the occasional pop from the wood stove, but that was it. No wind, no movement outside, just stillness. Then one night something changed. I woke up to a sound, faint at first, but enough to pull me out of sleep. A steady, rhythmic crunching, footsteps. My first thought was that an animal had wandered close, but these weren't random. They were deliberate, slow. They moved around the side of the cabin, stopping just beneath my bedroom window. I held my breath, straining to hear more. Then, nothing, just silence. I lay there for a long time, listening. My heart pounded, my mind raced. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I fell asleep. By morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. But when I stepped outside, I saw them, tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They led from the woods to my window, then back the way they came, disappearing into the tree line. I told myself it had to be a hunter passing through, maybe someone who hadn't realized the cabin was occupied. But why come up to the window? Why stand there? I spent the day watching the tree line, waiting for someone to come back, to explain themselves. No one did. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire low, listening. But nothing came. The woods remained still. The next day, I followed the tracks. They led deep into the trees, winding through the snow, always in a straight line. I followed them for nearly a mile before they suddenly stopped. No signs of turning around, no sign of anything, just an ending in the middle of nowhere. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and tried to shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself I was being paranoid. But that night, the footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop at my window. They circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate. The snow muffled the sound, but I knew what I was hearing. Someone was out there, walking in loops around the place. I grabbed the hatchet I kept by the door and waited, heart hammering. Minutes passed. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then, a sharp, deliberate knock on the front door. I didn't move. Didn't breathe, just stood there, gripping the hatchet, my pulse pounding in my ears. Another knock, slow, hard. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They knew I was inside. They were waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The footsteps retreated. I stayed up until dawn, too afraid to sleep. When morning came, I found more tracks. Not just leading to the door, but to the windows, the shed, even behind the cabin. Someone had been watching from every angle. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But my truck was parked at the end of a narrow, snow-covered path. If someone wanted to block me in, it wouldn't be hard. I decided to wait one more night. Just one. Then I'd leave at first light. That night, I kept the fire burning bright. I stayed awake, listening. Hours passed. Then, sometime around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. But not footsteps. This time, it was breathing. Right outside the wall. Slow. Heavy. Like someone standing inches away, waiting. I didn't move. I just gripped the hatchet tighter and listened. The breathing stayed for what felt like forever. Then, just like that, it was gone. No footsteps. No retreating sounds. Just silence. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother looking for more tracks. I didn't want to know. I drove until I hit the main road, until the cabin was miles behind me. A week later, I got a call from the guy who had given me the cabin. He asked how my stay was, said his uncle had just gone up there for the season. I hesitated, then asked if anyone else had been around, maybe a neighbor or another hunter. His response chilled me. No one else lives up there. Closest neighbor's 10 miles out. My uncle doesn't let anyone on his land. I didn't tell him what happened. I just thanked him and hung up. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I won't ever go back. I drove up to the cabin just as the sun was dipping behind the treetops, washing the sky in a deep orange glow. The dirt road had been rough, the tires kicking up dust as I navigated the winding path through dense forest. The place was secluded, which was exactly what I wanted. No neighbors, no traffic, just silence and space to clear my head for the week ahead. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, a one-story structure with a slanted roof, built from heavy logs that had darkened with age. There was a front porch with a couple of worn-out chairs and a fire pit a few yards away. The forest pressed in on all sides, tall pines stretching high, their branches shifting slightly in the evening breeze. I parked beside the cabin, grabbed my bag, and made my way inside. The interior smelled like wood and dust, but it was clean. A small kitchen, a couch pushed against the wall, a single bedroom with a stiff-looking bed. It wasn't much, but it would do. I put my things down and decided to step outside while there was still some light left. The quiet was thick, the kind that settles heavy in your chest when you're deep in the woods, far from people. I stood there for a while, listening to the leaves rustling, the distant call of a bird. Then I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A figure standing just at the tree line, barely visible in the fading light. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My stomach tightened. It wasn't normal to see someone way out here. The nearest town was nearly an hour's drive away, and this wasn't a place you just stumbled upon. I tried to make out details, but the shadows hid his face. I forced myself to turn away, pretending I hadn't seen him. If he was some lost hiker, he'd call out. If he was just passing through, he'd move on. I went back inside, locked the door, and checked the window. He was gone. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise had me wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I got up in the morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the cabin. Fresh ones, leading from the trees to the porch. My skin crawled. Whoever it was, they had come right up to my door in the middle of the night. I spent the day trying to shake it off. I hiked a little, fished in the stream a few miles away, did anything to keep my mind busy. But the unease never left. Every time I looked at the tree line, I half expected to see him again. And then, as the sun started to set, I did. He was closer this time, standing at the edge of the clearing, his posture eerily still. He was tall, wearing dark clothing, his face still hidden in shadow. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I went inside, locked the door again, and made sure every window was secured. I checked my phone, no service. Of course, I had planned on being off the grid, but now it felt like a mistake. I considered leaving, but driving that narrow dirt road at night wasn't something I wanted to risk. I decided I'd leave first thing in the morning. I barely slept again, and when I did, it was restless. I dreamt of someone standing over me, of fingers tapping against the window, of whispers just outside the cabin. When I woke, my chest was tight with dread. Then I heard it, the sound of something moving outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. I held my breath. My mind raced. I had no weapons, no way to defend myself. The cabin was sturdy, but not impenetrable. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron pan, and moved quietly to the front door. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, every muscle in my body locked in place. Then the doorknob turned. It didn't rattle like someone trying to force their way in. It turned slowly, carefully, as if whoever was outside wanted to see if it was unlocked. My throat tightened. I raised the pan, ready to swing if I had to. The knob turned again, then stopped. More silence. And then, finally, the sound of footsteps retreating, disappearing into the woods. I didn't move until the sun started to rise. When I finally worked up the nerve to open the door, I found muddy handprints smeared on the wood. I packed my things faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't care how rough the road was. I needed to get out of there. I threw my bag in the truck, started the engine, and sped off, my heart still hammering. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him again, standing at the tree line, watching me leave. I never looked back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in town, surrounded by people. I never went back to that cabin. I never even told anyone what happened. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see him, standing there, waiting. I woke up to the sound of the wind rattling the old window panes of my cabin. The wood creaked as the cold settled into its bones, the fire in the stone hearth having long since burned down to smoldering embers. I pulled the thick wool blanket tighter around my shoulders and sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Outside, the darkness still clung to the trees, the sky barely starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I had come out here alone for a week of hunting, something I had done many times before. My cabin sat deep in the woods, far from any roads or towns, a place where I could truly be by myself. It wasn't much, a single room with a cot, a stove, and a few shelves stocked with supplies, but it was all I needed. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I preferred it that way. I reached over to the small wooden table beside my cot and grabbed my flashlight. The batteries were still strong, the beam cutting through the dim interior of the cabin. My rifle leaned against the wall next to the door, ready to go. I had spent the previous day scouting the area, following fresh deer tracks through the trees, and I had a good feeling about today. The crisp morning air would be perfect for tracking. I dressed quickly, layering up against the cold, and laced up my boots. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved toward the door, unlocking it and pushing it open. A gust of icy wind rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The snow from the previous night had left a thin layer of white across the ground, the kind that would make tracking easier. Stepping outside, I took a deep breath and slung my rifle over my shoulder. The forest stretched out in every direction, dark and quiet, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the pale morning light. I had a specific spot in mind, a clearing by a stream about a mile from the cabin where I had seen plenty of deer sign the day before. I moved carefully through the trees, my boots crunching softly on the snow. The air was so still that every sound seemed amplified, the rustling of branches, the distant call of a crow, the faint gurgling of the stream ahead. I paused every so often to scan my surroundings, checking for movement. The world felt untouched out here, like time had slowed to a crawl. As I neared the clearing, I crouched low, moving with more caution. The stream cut through the land in a winding path, its banks lined with tracks. I studied them closely. Some were fresh, very fresh. My heart quickened. I had just missed something. I moved slowly, following the trail, my rifle at the ready. The forest had gone eerily quiet, and that's when I noticed it. The tracks I was following were no longer deer tracks. My breath hitched as I bent down, examining them more closely. These were much larger, too large for a deer. My stomach tightened as I realized they were from a bear. I had seen bear tracks before, but these were fresh, and they were heading in the same direction I had come from, toward my cabin. A cold sweat broke out on my back as I stood up, scanning the woods around me. I had been so focused on the deer tracks that I hadn't been paying attention to what else was out here. My gut told me I wasn't alone. I turned back the way I had come, moving quickly but carefully, my senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig made my pulse hammer. I had no desire to surprise a bear, especially not this far from help. As I got closer to the cabin, I slowed down, my rifle raised. Something wasn't right. The door to the cabin was open. I knew I had shut it when I left. My stomach twisted into a knot. I crept closer, stepping as lightly as I could. The fresh snow around the cabin was disturbed. Large, heavy tracks leading right up to the door. I took a deep breath, gripping my rifle tightly as I peered inside. The cabin was a mess. My supplies were scattered across the floor. The cot overturned. Deep scratches gouged into the wood near the door. My heart pounded as I took it all in. The bear had been inside. I backed away slowly, scanning the treeline. The tracks led back into the woods, meaning the bear had already left, but it could still be close. I needed to secure the cabin before nightfall. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the door, cleaning up, and keeping my rifle within arm's reach. The thought of that bear returning stayed with me, a constant weight in the back of my mind. That night, I barely slept, listening to every sound outside, every whisper of wind through the trees. The fire burned bright, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I had come out here for solitude, for the thrill of the hunt, but now I felt like the hunted. Morning came slowly, the sky a dull gray as snow began to fall again. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold air. The tracks from the bear were already fading beneath the fresh snow, but I knew it was still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching, waiting. I had planned to stay the full week, but my instincts told me it was time to leave. I packed my gear, loaded my rifle, and took one last look at the cabin before heading down the trail. The wilderness had given me plenty of good hunts over the years, but this time, it had given me a different kind of memory, one I wouldn't soon forget. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I didn't look back. I just kept moving, knowing that out here in the deep woods, the wild always has the last word. The cabin sat deep in the woods, built decades ago by my grandfather, a place meant for solitude and hunting trips. It was nestled in a valley between two ridges, surrounded by thick pines and tangled underbrush. The only way in was an old logging road, barely maintained, winding through the forest for miles before reaching the clearing. I had come alone, looking to spend a few days away from everything. I had been here before, but always with family. This was my first time staying by myself. It was late October, and the cold had already settled into the mountains. The leaves had turned and fallen, covering the ground in a thick layer that crunched underfoot. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth, the kind of crisp mountain air that made your breath visible in the mornings. The cabin was simple, one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a loft where the bed was. The windows had thick wooden shutters, and the door was heavy, reinforced with iron hinges. I arrived in the afternoon, unloaded my truck, and stacked firewood by the porch. The silence of the woods was comforting at first, the only sounds being the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. I spent the evening setting up, making sure the firewood was dry, the propane stove worked, and my rifle was loaded. It was just habit out here. You never knew when you might need it. That night, I sat by the fire outside, staring into the flames. The night sky above was endless, a black void filled with stars. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. It was only then that I noticed how quiet it had become. The usual night sounds, crickets, distant owls had disappeared. I listened closely, but there was nothing, just silence. I felt a strange unease settle over me, the kind that prickles the back of your neck, makes you feel watched. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The woods were full of predators, bears, coyotes, but they usually kept their distance. Still, I didn't stay outside much longer. I stoked the fire in the wood stove and locked the door before heading to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire in the stove had burned low, leaving only a faint orange glow. The wind had picked up again, rattling the trees outside. Then I heard it, a sound I couldn't place at first. It was low, almost like a growl, but stretched out, deep and throaty. My mind raced, trying to match it to something familiar. Then it came again, closer this time. A mountain lion. I had heard them before, but never this close. It was a sound that sent a shiver down your spine. Something primal that told you, without a doubt, you weren't the top predator out here. I reached for my rifle, my hands steady but my pulse pounding. I listened, waiting for another sound, anything to tell me where it was. The cabin had thick walls, and I knew I was safe inside, but that sound, it felt like it was right outside. Minutes passed, then an hour. I stayed awake, straining to hear over the wind. Eventually, sleep took over, but it was restless, my dreams filled with shadows moving just beyond the firelight. The next morning, I stepped outside, rifle in hand. The air was colder than the day before, the kind of cold that clings to your bones. I scanned the ground near the cabin, and my stomach dropped. Tracks, big ones, leading up to the porch, circling it, then heading back toward the treeline. The mountain lion had come right up to the cabin in the night. I looked around, scanning the woods, but everything was still. I told myself it was probably just passing through, maybe curious about the smell of the fire or the food I had cooked the night before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with me yet. That day, I stayed close to the cabin, gathering more firewood, checking the perimeter. The sun was bright, but it did little to warm the air. I saw no other signs of the mountain lion, but I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. As night fell, I double-checked the shutters, making sure they were secure. I kept the fire going, the rifle close by. I tried to convince myself that last night had been a one-time thing, that the animal had moved on. But deep down, I knew better. It was around midnight when I heard it again. This time, closer. The same low, guttural growl right outside the cabin. My heart pounded as I sat up, gripping the rifle. Then came the sound of something moving against the cabin walls. A heavy, dragging sound. My breath caught in my throat. I turned off the lantern, leaving only the faint glow of the fire. I moved slowly to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to see outside. The darkness was almost complete, but then I saw it. A shape moving in the shadows, low to the ground, sleek, powerful. The mountain lion was right there, just feet away from the cabin. It was sniffing around, moving slowly, as if searching for a way inside. I held my breath. Then, without warning, it reared up, paws hitting the wooden walls with a heavy thud. I stepped back, heart racing. The cabin was sturdy, but I wasn't about to test how much force those claws could exert. I had no choice. I grabbed my rifle, moved to the door as quietly as I could, and unlatched it just enough to see outside. I had one shot to scare it off. I raised the rifle and fired into the air. The explosion shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, I heard it retreating, moving swiftly back into the woods. I listened for a long time, waiting to see if it would return. But the night was silent once more. The next morning, I found deep scratches along the walls of the cabin, claw marks that cut through the wood like it was nothing. The tracks led away into the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. I had scared it off, but I knew it would be back. This was its territory, not mine. I packed up that morning, loading everything into the truck. As much as I wanted to stay, I wasn't stupid. A mountain lion that bold wasn't something to take lightly. I had come looking for solitude, but I had found something else instead. A reminder that out here, in the deep woods, you were never truly alone. As I drove down the old logging road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin stood there, quiet, untouched. But in the distance, just beyond the trees, I thought I saw movement. A flicker of something pale against the shadows. Then it was gone. I didn't stop to look closer. I just kept driving, leaving the cabin, and whatever was watching me behind. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The cabin was old but sturdy, nestled deep in the woods, far from any town or neighbor. It was the kind of place where you could hear nothing but the wind through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. A friend of mine owned it but hadn't visited in years. He said it was too much work to keep up, but he let me stay there for a week if I wanted. I was looking for some peace and quiet, some time away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. The drive out was long, taking me over miles of rough dirt roads that wound through thick forest. The trees were so dense that sunlight barely made it through in some places. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin sat at the end of the road, a small one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a few old supplies left behind. It smelled of dust and aged wood, but it was sturdy enough. I spent the first night adjusting to the silence. Every creak of the trees or rustling of the underbrush outside made me instinctively listen, but there was nothing unusual, just nature going about its business. I had a small battery-powered lantern for light, but I kept it dim, not wanting to attract too many bugs. The second night was different. It was colder than before, and the wind had picked up. I was sitting outside on the small porch when I heard it, the snap of a branch breaking in the woods. Not just any snap, but the sound of something heavy stepping on it. I turned my head in the direction of the noise, but the forest was pitch black beyond the small reach of my lantern. I listened. Another step, then nothing, just the wind again. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal moving through, but the way the footsteps had stopped after just a couple of steps made me uneasy. Animals don't just stop like that. They move, they forage. They don't creep up and then go still. I decided to go inside for the night and lock the door. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound outside had my nerves on edge. The wind made the trees groan, and now and then, I swore I heard something moving. But I never saw anything when I checked. The third night was worse. I had been out gathering some firewood just before dark when I noticed something off. Some of the trees near the cabin had deep scratches in the bark, high up, much higher than any bear could reach. They weren't old marks either. The sap was fresh, glistening in the dim evening light. I tried to push it out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I sat by the fire that night, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The woods, which had felt peaceful before, now felt suffocating. The trees seemed to loom closer, their shadows stretching toward me like fingers. Then the noise came back, not just footsteps this time, but a deep, guttural breathing. It was heavy, deliberate, and close. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but then it stopped. Dead silence followed, as if the entire forest had been swallowed up by something unseen. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the tree line. First, I saw nothing, just the dense black of the woods. But then eyes, reflecting back at me just above the underbrush. They were too high to belong to a normal animal, higher than a wolf, higher than any bear I had ever seen. And they weren't just glowing from the reflection of my light. They were staring, unblinking. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring back, my mind trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Then, as if it had lost interest, the eyes vanished. I heard heavy steps retreating into the woods and then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my hatchet close, every muscle in my body tense. The next morning, I packed up my things. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to stay long enough to find out. I drove away as soon as the sun was up, glancing back at the cabin in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the trees. I never told my friend what happened. I don't think he would have believed me anyway, but I know what I saw, and I know I'll never go back there again. I took a deep breath as I stepped out of my truck, the cold air biting at my skin. The cabin stood in the middle of nowhere, a simple wooden structure surrounded by towering pines and thick undergrowth. It had been years since I last visited, but nothing had changed. The wooden porch still creaked under my weight, and the windows, covered in a thin layer of dust, reflected the fading light of the evening sky. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The inside smelled of old wood and damp air. The furniture was simple, just a couch, a small table, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. The floor was covered in dust, except for the path I had just made. I set my bags down inside. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and the quiet. By the time I got the fire going, the sky outside had turned dark. The cabin's glow barely reached the tree line. I stood on the porch, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, carrying the distant sound of some small animal moving through the undergrowth. It felt peaceful, almost too quiet. I went back inside, locked the door, and set my phone on the table. No signal, of course. That was part of the reason I came here. No distractions, no noise, just solitude. I cooked a simple meal on the old propane stove, ate quickly, and settled into the couch with a book. The fire crackled softly, the only real sound in the cabin. Then I heard it, a faint crunch outside, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I froze. My eyes flicked toward the window, but all I saw was darkness. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, wandering too close. I ignored it and kept reading. Another crunch, this time closer. I set the book down. My heartbeat picked up as I leaned forward, trying to listen. The fire popped, sending a small burst of sparks into the air. Then silence. I told myself it was nothing. Animals roamed the forest at night all the time. I forced myself to relax, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave. An hour later, I was in bed, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The cabin was dark except for the dim light from my flashlight resting on the nightstand. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Then the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside the window. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. The steps were too heavy to be an animal. I reached for the flashlight and pointed it toward the window. Nothing. The glass reflected the dim light, making it impossible to see anything outside. But I felt it. Someone was there, standing just beyond the reach of the light. Tap. Light, almost playful, against the glass. I didn't move. My body was frozen in place, my ears straining for any other sound. Then another tap, more forceful this time. My hand closed around the flashlight as I slowly slid out of bed. I crept toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest. When I was close enough, I angled the flashlight and turned it toward the glass. A face. It was right there, pressed against the window. Pale skin, stretched too tight over sharp features. The eyes were too wide, unblinking, staring straight at me. The mouth was twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. And in one hand, held up against the glass, was a shard of broken glass, the edges jagged and gleaming in the light. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The face didn't move. The figure just stood there, watching me. My mind raced. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. But the thing that scared me the most was the way they stood there, completely still, like they had all the time in the world. I grabbed my bag, my keys, anything I could reach. I wasn't staying. I moved quickly, keeping my eyes on the window as I backed toward the door. The figure didn't move. I reached for the lock, my hands trembling. I had to make a run for it, get to the truck, and drive until I was far away from this place. The moment I unlocked the door, I heard it, the sound of glass shattering. I spun around just in time to see the window break inward, shards flying across the room. The figure was gone, but I knew they were close. I threw the door open and ran. The cold air hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. My feet pounded against the ground as I sprinted toward my truck. I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in short gasps. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. They weren't running toward me, they were circling. I got the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut. My fingers shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, gravel spraying as I backed out. My headlights cut through the darkness, and for a split second, I saw them standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the light. The glass shard was still in their hand, but their face had changed. The grin was gone, replaced with something else, something cold and empty. I didn't wait. I floored the gas, tires skidding against the dirt as I sped down the road. The cabin disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the trees. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, pulling into a gas station on the outskirts of a small town. I sat there for a long time, my head against the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had no proof, no evidence, just a broken window in an old cabin and a face burned into my memory. I never went back. I never told anyone. The cabin is still there, sitting in the middle of nowhere, its broken window staring out into the woods. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they're still there too, standing just beyond the light, watching, waiting, with that same jagged piece of glass in their hand. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. The sun was still out, but it was starting to dip lower, sending long shadows across the clearing. The place was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. I had driven for nearly an hour down a dirt road before finally pulling up in front of it. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, made of thick logs with a slanted roof. There was a small porch with a single wooden chair, and to the right, an old fire pit surrounded by a few moss-covered stones. It had clearly been sitting here for years, untouched for the most part. I had come out here alone, looking for a weekend of quiet. Life had been stressful, and I wanted a break from people, from noise, from everything. I brought enough supplies to last a few days. Canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a hunting knife just in case. My phone had no signal, but that was expected. I wasn't planning on using it anyway. The inside of the cabin was just as simple as the outside. A single room with a small wood stove, an old table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a few shelves with some dusty old supplies. There was a small window on each side, all of them covered with heavy curtains. I set my bag down on the table and opened one of the windows slightly to let in some fresh air. The scent of pine and damp earth drifted in. It was peaceful, quiet, exactly what I wanted. As the sun set, I lit a small fire in the stove and made myself some food. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. I assumed it was the wind or maybe a small animal. It was deep in the woods, of course there would be wildlife. After eating, I sat outside on the porch for a while, listening. The woods seemed still, only the faint chirping of insects breaking the silence. The stars were starting to come out, bright against the black sky. It was beautiful out here, but there was something about the emptiness that made me uneasy. Maybe it was just being alone in such an isolated place. I shook the feeling off and went inside, locking the door behind me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fire in the stove had burned down to glowing embers, giving the room a faint orange glow. Outside, the forest was silent. Too silent. I had expected to hear more. Owls, night animals moving around. But there was nothing. Just a heavy, suffocating quiet. I told myself it was normal, that the woods could be unpredictable. Still, I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound made me tense up, listening closely, waiting for something more. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. Something had made a sound outside. A low, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to hear. Another step, and another. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on and shining it toward the window, but the heavy curtain blocked most of the light. I wanted to move to check outside, but I felt frozen. Then the footsteps stopped. Complete silence again. I sat there, gripping my flashlight, barely breathing. Maybe it had just been a deer or some other animal passing through. But I wasn't convinced. The steps had been slow, steady, too precise for an animal. I waited, listening. Nothing. After a long while, I finally forced myself to lie back down, though I kept the flashlight in my hand. I didn't sleep much after that, drifting in and out, waking up at every small noise. Morning eventually came, and the first thing I did was step outside and check around the cabin. The ground was damp, the leaves still wet from the night air. There were footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. Human footprints. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. Someone had been out here, walking around while I slept. They didn't come to the door, didn't knock, didn't call out. Just walked in slow circles. I followed the tracks a little way into the woods, but they disappeared into the underbrush. Whoever it was, they knew how to move through the forest without leaving much behind. I told myself it was just a lost hiker, but deep down, I didn't believe it. A lost hiker would have called out for help, approached the cabin, knocked on the door. They wouldn't have just wandered around in the dark without saying a word. I spent the day feeling on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig made me tense up. I debated leaving early, but I had planned to stay for the weekend, and I didn't want to let my nerves get the best of me. So I stayed, but I kept my knife on me at all times, and before nightfall, I locked every window and checked the door twice. That night, I barely slept. I kept my flashlight on, listening. I didn't hear footsteps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching the cabin. I stayed awake as long as I could, dozing off only when exhaustion took over. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up to a noise. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of metal scraping against wood. My blood ran cold. Someone was at the door, trying to pick the lock. I jumped up, gripping my knife, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The scraping stopped. Silence. I stood there, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Then, slowly, the doorknob turned. It rattled once, twice, testing. I held my breath, gripping the knife tighter. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't dare move until the first light of dawn came through the window. When I finally opened the door, there was nothing there. No sign of anyone. But on the ground, just outside the cabin, was a single, long scratch along the wood of the doorframe, right next to the lock. That was enough. I grabbed my things, threw them in my bag, and left. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, speeding down that dirt road as fast as I could. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't ever want to find out. I took a trip to a remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was a last-minute decision, something I had been thinking about for a while but never followed through on. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my uncle's, a retired forest ranger who had built it himself. He didn't use it much anymore, said he was getting too old for the cold, and offered it up to anyone in the family who wanted a weekend of solitude. It was a 6-hour drive from where I lived, mostly highways at first, then narrowing to back roads that twisted through thick pine forests. The last stretch was nothing more than a dirt path, barely wide enough for my truck. The trees pressed in on both sides, making it feel like I was driving through a tunnel of green. There was no cell service out here, no radio stations except for static. It felt like I was heading somewhere completely cut off from the rest of the world. The cabin itself was small, just a one-room structure with a loft for sleeping. It sat near a frozen lake, the trees breaking just enough to give a view of the water. There was a fire pit out front, stacked logs beside it, and an outhouse about 30 yards away. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar and dust. There was a wood stove for heat, a few shelves stocked with canned goods, and an old cot pushed up against the wall. Simple, but more than enough for a weekend alone. I unpacked my gear, set up my sleeping bag in the loft, and got a fire going in the stove. The warmth spread through the cabin quickly, filling the space with the comforting crackle of burning wood. I made a quick dinner from a can of chili I found on the shelf and settled in for the night, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was peaceful, exactly what I had been looking for. I woke up sometime after midnight to complete silence. The kind that makes your ears ring because there's nothing to listen to. No wind, no rustling branches, not even the distant sound of an animal moving through the forest. It was unsettling. I sat up in the loft, looking down at the dim glow of the fire in the stove. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the way absolute silence can make you hear things that aren't there. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the frozen snow. Not an animal. Too heavy, too measured. Someone was walking outside my cabin. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, straining to hear. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I waited, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then came another sound, something tapping against the wooden walls. Light like a finger tracing along the logs. It moved around the cabin, pausing every few seconds. My mouth was dry, my body tense, every muscle locked in place. I wanted to look out the window, but I couldn't make myself move. Whoever was out there was standing just beyond my line of sight. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and flicked it on, shining it down into the main room. Nothing, just the cabin exactly as I had left it. The tapping had stopped, the footsteps gone. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I dozed off, though my sleep was restless, filled with uneasy dreams. In the morning, I stepped outside to find the snow around the cabin disturbed. Footprints, clear as day, circling the structure multiple times. They led away from the cabin and disappeared into the tree line. My stomach turned. Someone had been here. Someone had walked around my cabin in the middle of the night, and I had no idea who or why. I thought about packing up and leaving right then and there, but I convinced myself it had to be some local hunter or hiker who had gotten turned around. Maybe they saw my truck, got curious. It was unsettling, but not enough to make me cut the trip short. Still, I kept my gun a little closer that day, taking it with me whenever I stepped outside. The second night, I made sure to lock the door and latch the wooden shutters over the windows. The cabin had no electricity, so I relied on the firelight and a few battery-powered lanterns. I tried to convince myself that the footprints were nothing to worry about, that I was safe inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I ate quickly, barely tasting my food, then climbed into the loft, keeping the flashlight within reach. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was the door handle rattling. I shot upright, my heart hammering. The latch held, but the sound continued, slow and persistent. Someone was trying to get in. I reached for my gun with shaking hands, gripping it tight as I listened. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. Silence. Then came the footsteps again, moving around the cabin, stopping just below the loft window. I held my breath, my finger hovering over the trigger. I could hear breathing, slow, steady, just outside the wall. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening. Minutes? Hours? Eventually, the sounds faded, and I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the gun with white-knuckled hands. The moment the sun was up, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother eating breakfast, didn't even check to see if there were more footprints. I just grabbed my gear, threw it in the truck, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, until the trees thinned and I could see other cars. Only then did I let myself breathe, my mind racing with everything that had happened. I never told my uncle's friend what I experienced. I never asked if he had ever seen anyone out there before. I just thanked him for letting me use the cabin and never went back. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, But I do know one thing for certain. I was not alone that night. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. A remote cabin deep in the woods. No cell service, no neighbors, nothing but quiet. I needed the break. Work had been draining me, and I wanted some time away from everything. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature. The drive was long, and the road turned rough about an hour before I arrived. Pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt with potholes deep enough to jolt my entire truck. The trees grew thicker, taller, pressing in around me as I made my way up the narrow path. The directions I'd been given were simple: follow the road until you reach the clearing. There's only one cabin out there. You can't miss it. When I finally pulled up, the cabin was smaller than I'd imagined. A simple one-room structure with a porch that had clearly seen better days. The wood was aged, cracked in places, but the place looked solid. The trees around it were massive, towering pines that swayed gently in the breeze. There was a small shed off to the side, weathered and leaning slightly. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I grabbed my bag from the truck and made my way up to the cabin. The door was stiff, but it opened with a hard push. Inside, it was exactly as rustic as I'd expected. A wood stove in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a bed against the far wall. There was no electricity, no running water, just a few old oil lamps and a stack of firewood next to the stove. I spent the first hour getting settled, sweeping out the dust, unpacking my supplies. I brought enough food for a week, plenty of water, a good book, and a rifle just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but being this deep in the woods, it was better to be prepared. I locked the truck, double-checked that I had everything I needed, and settled in for the night. The first night was peaceful, the kind of silence you don't get in the city. No cars, no distant hum of electricity, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the sounds of the forest. I slept soundly, waking only once to the distant call of an owl. The next morning, I took my time, made coffee over the wood stove, sat on the porch, and just listened. The forest was alive with sounds: birds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I decided to take a short hike, just to get a lay of the land. The trail behind the cabin was overgrown but easy enough to follow. It wound through the trees, dipping down into a small ravine before climbing back up onto a ridge. I walked for about an hour before turning back. That evening, as I was chopping wood, I felt it. A shift. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. A heavy, unnatural stillness. I stopped, gripping the axe, listening. A faint sound reached me, something moving through the trees. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. The footsteps were too steady, too measured. I turned toward the sound, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just shadows stretching long in the fading light. My pulse picked up. I wasn't exactly scared, but I was on edge. I forced myself to go back to chopping, telling myself it was just my imagination. The moment passed. The forest seemed to breathe again, and I went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I'd heard something outside. A branch breaking, the crunch of leaves. But every time I got up to check, there was nothing. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I found footprints near the edge of the clearing. Not boot prints, bare feet, human. They were fresh. The dirt still crumbled at the edges. I spent the rest of the day with my rifle close. I told myself it was probably some hermit, someone living off the land, maybe a hunter passing through. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Why would someone be walking barefoot out here? That evening, I sat on the porch, waiting, watching. The sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched longer. Then I saw it. Movement, just beyond the tree line. A shape, person. They were standing still, just watching me. I gripped my rifle, heart hammering. I stood, raising the gun slightly, not pointing it directly at them, but making it clear I was armed. They didn't move. They just stood there. I shouted, demanding to know who they were, what they wanted. No answer. They turned, walking back into the trees without a sound. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise had me gripping the rifle, waiting. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed my gear quickly, throwing everything into the truck. As I turned the key, the engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, checking the engine, but I'm no mechanic. All I knew was that the truck wasn't going anywhere. I felt it before I heard it. That silence again. The oppressive stillness. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. The figure was there again. Closer this time, standing just at the edge of the clearing. And now I could see them clearly. A man, gaunt, pale, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His clothes were rags, filthy and torn. His eyes were dark, sunken. He was staring at me. I grabbed my rifle, aiming this time. My voice was steady when I told him to leave. He didn't react, just tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. Then he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too forced. He took a step forward. I fired a warning shot into the ground. He didn't flinch. Another step. I fired again, this time at his feet. He stopped. The smile vanished. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he turned, walking back into the trees. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag, my rifle, and started walking. The road was miles long, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying. I walked fast, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. As I crested the first hill, I glanced back. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, but he was there, standing on the porch, watching me leave. I didn't stop walking until I reached the nearest highway, flagged down a passing truck, and got a ride back to town. I told the sheriff everything. He nodded, listened, but I could tell he didn't believe me. A week later, I sent a tow truck to retrieve my truck. The driver called me when he got there, said the cabin was empty, no sign of anyone. But my truck, the engine had been ripped apart, not just broken, destroyed, as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. I never went back. I don't know who he was or why he was out there, but I do know one thing. He wanted me to leave, and I did. I had always wanted a quiet weekend away from everything. No emails, no phone calls, just me, the woods, and a small cabin I had found online. It was listed as an old hunting cabin, about 20 miles from the nearest town, deep in the forest. The owner assured me it was safe, though a bit rustic. That was fine by me. I wanted to disconnect, to get away from the constant noise of life. So, I packed up my truck with a cooler of food, a sleeping bag, and some basic supplies, and I made the drive up there late in the afternoon. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, just a narrow dirt path that wound through thick trees. I had to take it slow to avoid potholes and fallen branches. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already dipping behind the treetops. The place looked just like the pictures, small, with a slanted roof and a front porch that sagged a little at the edges. There was an old fire pit outside, a rusty axe stuck in a stump, and a few wooden chairs that looked like they hadn't been used in years. I stepped inside, and the air smelled of old wood and dust. It was simple. A single room with a bed in one corner, a wood stove in the other, and a small table near the only window. The owner had left a few supplies: matches, some firewood, a lantern, and a note reminding me there was no running water. I had brought my own, so that wasn't a problem. I set my bag down and went outside to gather some extra firewood. The sun was nearly gone now, the sky turning deep blue. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves. It was peaceful, the kind of silence I had been looking for. I built a small fire outside, cooked a simple meal, and sat there for a while, listening to the night sounds. It felt good to be alone, away from everything. Sometime after I went inside and settled into the old bed, I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal, at least not any that I recognized. It was a low, deliberate crunching of leaves, like someone stepping carefully through the underbrush. I lay still, listening. It stopped. Then, a few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. My heart started pounding. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it out the window, but I couldn't see anything. Just trees and darkness. The sound had stopped. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, or maybe a deer passing through. I turned off the flashlight and tried to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. It was dead silent. The fire outside had gone out, and the inside of the cabin was completely dark. I wasn't sure what had woken me up at first, but then I heard it again, that slow, careful movement outside. It was closer now, just beyond the porch. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then something pressed against the window. A shadow, a shape, not an animal. Someone was out there. I reached for the axe I had brought inside earlier and gripped the handle tightly. The shape at the window moved away. I heard the creak of the wooden porch. Whoever it was, they were right outside. My mind raced. I was miles away from anyone. No cell service. No way to call for help. I had locked the door before bed, but the cabin was old. The lock was just a simple latch. The porch creaked again. Then silence. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I started to think maybe they had left, that maybe I had imagined it. Then, a soft tap at the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, gripping the axe, staring at the door. The tap came again. Not a knock, just a light, almost playful tapping, like someone testing the wood. Then, nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. I didn't hear anything else. No more footsteps, no more tapping. The woods stayed silent. When the first light of dawn started to seep through the trees, I finally worked up the courage to open the door. Nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had seen. I didn't waste time. I packed up my things, threw everything in the truck, and left. I didn't even stop to check if I had forgotten anything. I just wanted to get out of there. The whole drive back to town, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something in the trees, something following me. I never found out who or what was out there that night. I told myself it was probably just some local messing with me, maybe a hunter passing through. But the way they moved, the way they tapped at the door in the middle of the night, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt like something else, something I was never supposed to see. I never went back to that cabin. I was looking forward to the weekend away. A friend of a friend had a cabin deep in the woods, far from the main roads. No cell service, nothing but trees and the lake a short hike away. It wasn't a fancy place, just a one-room cabin with an old wood stove, a creaky bunk bed, and a porch that leaned a little too much to the right. It had been sitting empty for months, and when the offer came to use it for a weekend of fishing and just getting away from everything, I took it without hesitation. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The directions were simple. Turn onto the dirt road past mile marker 15, drive straight until the old fire watchtower, then turn left onto the overgrown path and keep going until the trees clear out and the cabin comes into view. It sounded easy enough, but the road was rough, full of potholes, and the farther I went, the more I realized how isolated it was. No cars, no houses, not even a mailbox. Just endless trees and silence, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against you. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The sky was gray, thick clouds rolling in, making it look later than it was. The cabin looked just like I expected, small, weathered, the kind of place that had been patched up over the years rather than properly maintained. I killed the engine, grabbed my bag, and stepped out. The smell of damp earth and pine filled the air, and the only sound was the wind pushing through the trees. The first thing I did was check the door. The key had been left under a loose board on the porch, just like I had been told. The lock was stiff, but with a little force, it turned, and the door swung open with a low groan. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and dust. The single window let in just enough light to see the basics. A small table with 2 chairs, a set of shelves with some cans of food, a few rusted tools, and the bunk bed in the corner with a thin, worn-out mattress. The wood stove sat near the wall, a pile of split logs beside it. I set my bag down and decided to check around outside before it got dark. The cabin sat in a small clearing, the tree leaned close enough that it felt boxed in. To the left, a narrow path led toward the lake, barely visible through the thick underbrush. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched out in all directions, dense and unmarked, the kind of place where you could wander 100 feet in and lose your sense of direction. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stove, ate a can of chili I had brought, and listened to the quiet. It was strange, being so far from everything. No hum of traffic, no distant voices, nothing but the occasional creak of the trees in the wind. I tried reading a book I had packed, but the dim light made it difficult, so I eventually turned in for the night. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It took me a moment to realize what had disturbed me. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room cold. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me and listened. At first, there was nothing but the wind. Then, from somewhere outside, I heard something, a soft, deliberate crunching of leaves. I held my breath, waiting, listening. It wasn't the wind. Wind moves through the trees, rustling the leaves in waves, but this was different. These were individual steps, slow, careful. I sat up, every nerve in my body on edge. The sound stopped. For several long minutes, I stayed still, staring at the door, waiting for something else, but nothing came. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon nosing around. Still, it took me a long time to fall back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was damp from the night's mist, but I could see them, footprints. They weren't deep, but they were there, just beyond the edge of the porch, leading from the trees and stopping near the steps. Human footprints. I scanned the tree line, heart pounding. There was nothing, just the thick woods stretching endlessly. I told myself they could have been old prints, maybe even my own from the day before, though deep down, I knew they weren't. I spent the morning trying to shake the feeling, hiking down to the lake, fishing for a while. The air was crisp, the water perfectly still, but I couldn't enjoy it. My mind kept drifting back to those prints, to the noise in the night. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping low. I decided to cut my trip short and leave the next morning. That night, I locked the door, stuffed the cracks with my extra clothes to block out the drafts, and kept my flashlight within reach. I sat up for a long time, listening, waiting. Then, just past midnight, it happened again. First, it was the wind, or at least I thought it was. But then, faint but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. They were closer this time, deliberate. My skin crawled. I gripped the flashlight and slid out of the bed as quietly as I could. I moved toward the door, careful not to make any noise. The sound stopped again. I stood there, heart hammering, barely breathing. Then, without warning, something pressed against the door. Slow, steady pressure. The old wood creaked, the handle rattled. I didn't wait. I lunged for the chair near the table, shoving it under the handle. The pressure on the door stopped. Silence. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body locked. Minutes passed. Then, from outside, the sound of footsteps retreating, slow at first, then faster, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and ran to my truck. The clearing was empty, but the footprints were there, fresh in the damp soil, leading back into the woods. I didn't look back. I started the engine and tore down the dirt road, not stopping until I hit pavement. I never told the friend what happened. I never asked who else might have known about that cabin. All I knew was that someone had been out there, watching, waiting, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out why.